The sound of zippers and wheels echoed through Terminal C like a restless heartbeat. Then came the shout, sharp, authoritative, the kind that freezes a crowd mid-step. Within seconds, two uniformed TSA officers had stepped in front of Dr. Malcolm Hayes, their hands hovering close to their holsters. "Sir, step aside. We need to ask you a few questions." The absurdity hit Malcolm before the fear. He had been on his way to deliver a keynote lecture at Harvard about racial equity in education. Yet here he was, at 7:42 a.m., being treated like a criminal in front of strangers sipping their Starbucks. His passport was in his hand, his boarding pass ready, but the officers didn't even look at them before motioning him toward the security inspection room. Murmurs rippled through the line. Some passengers avoided eye contact, others pulled out their phones. A little girl clutched her mother's coat, whispering, "Why are they taking him?" Inside the sterile white-walled room, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and hostility. A young officer with pale blue eyes and a jaw clenched tight began peppering him with questions. "Where are you coming from?" "Atlanta." "Purpose of your trip?" "I'm a professor. I'm speaking at Harvard." The officer's brows twitched, as if the words professor and black man in a suit didn't belong in the same sentence. Malcolm kept his voice steady, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. This wasn't his first encounter with suspicion, but each time it cut deeper. He thought of his students, how he'd told them change was possible, that the world was evolving. Right now, that belief felt paper-thin. Then came the accusation. "We received a tip about someone matching your description, smuggling contraband. You're being detained for further questioning." Matching your description. Malcolm had heard that phrase before in news stories, in police reports, in too many court transcripts to count. It was the phrase that had stolen lives. He considered staying silent, letting the process grind on, but then his phone buzzed. A familiar name flashed on the screen: Ambassador Claire Donovan. She wasn't just a friend. She was one of the most influential voices in U.S. foreign policy, someone Malcolm had met during a United Nations Education Summit. "Answer it." The officer barked, thinking it was routine. Malcolm pressed speaker. "Malcolm, I just got your text. Are you through security yet? The Harvard board is waiting on you, and the Secretary of State is here too. We can't start without you." The room fell silent. The younger officer blinked. The older one shifted uncomfortably. Outside the door, an intercom announcement echoed about a departing flight, but in here, it was as if time had stopped. The ambassador's voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" Malcolm could see it in their eyes. The instant they realized they'd made a mistake so colossal it might cost them more than just an awkward apology. The younger officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. The older, Oni, stocky man with a badge reading G. Miller was the first to recover his voice. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding, ma'am," Miller said into the air, though his eyes refused to meet Malcolm's. "A misunderstanding?" Claire's voice dripped with incredulity. "You have a tenured professor, a U.S. citizen, a keynote speaker for Harvard University, detained in a back room on the morning of a national education summit? I hope you have a very good reason, because I assure you this phone call isn't over." Miller's jaw tightened. "We were acting on a credible tip." "Credible to whom?" Claire shot back. "Because the last I checked, racial profiling doesn't qualify as credible under the Constitution." The younger officer looked like he wanted to melt into the linoleum. Malcolm, meanwhile, stood in the center of the room, hands folded over his briefcase, his posture as steady as a column. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. Claire's voice softened, but it was the kind of softness that preceded an earthquake. "Malcolm, I'll handle this. Don't say another word to them. Someone will be there in 10 minutes. The line went dead. A thick, uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Miller gestured stiffly toward the door. "You're free to go, sir." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. Free to go? After being accused of smuggling contraband? After being pulled out of line in front of 100 witnesses? His voice was calm, but each syllable landed like a gavel strike. "Tell me, Officer Miller, will you be walking out there with me to explain to those same people why I was singled out?" The older man hesitated. His authority was still intact in the technical sense, but in every other sense, it was already crumbling. Malcolm didn't wait for an answer. He walked out of the room, his shoes clicking on the polished tile like a metronome. Passengers stared as he emerged, some with relief, some with guilt. others with the shameless curiosity of people watching a car crash. A young black man near the seating area gave him a small note of quiet, wordless gesture of solidarity. Malcolm returned it with a faint smile before heading toward his gate. By the time he boarded his flight, his phone was buzzing with notifications. A journalist from the Boston Globe had already tweeted, "Witnessed a black professor being detained without cause at Logan Airport this morning. Heard a mention Harvard keynote. TSA needs to answer for this." Malcolm sighed. He hadn't decided whether he wanted the incident to become public now. It didn't matter. When the plane touched down in Boston, a man in a dark suit was waiting at the jet bridge. "Dr. Hayes?" he asked. "Yes. I'm Daniel Ross, legal counsel for Harvard University. Ambassador Donovan briefed us on the situation. I'll be accompanying you to the event and also to speak with the press. This is going to get coverage, sir, whether you want it or not." Malcolm rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I just want to give my lecture. But I won't lie, what happened this morning wasn't just about me. If it can highlight the broader issue, then maybe some good can come out of it." Ross nodded. "Then I suggest we control the narrative. TSA will issue a statement." But he glanced around, lowering his voice. "I've already spoken to a contact. The tip they acted on? Anonymous. No corroborating details. Just a call saying a tall black man with a briefcase was suspicious." Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. That description could have been half the conference attendees in the city that day. The Harvard auditorium was already full when they arrived. The hum of conversation died as Malcolm stepped onto the stage. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, not just because he was the keynote speaker, but because many of them already knew. He decided, in that moment, not to hide it. "Before I begin," he said into the microphone, "I need to tell you about something that happened to me this morning." A ripple went through the crowd. He recounted the story plainly, without embellishment. He told them about the tip, the detention, the phone call, and then let the silence hang. That moment in the airport wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern that affects millions of people in this country who happen to look like me. And here's the truth. I am standing here because I had the right connections, the right title, the right friend to make a phone call. But what happens to the person who doesn't? Somewhere in the back, a camera shutter clicked. My talk today was supposed to be about equity in education. But equity doesn't exist in isolation. It begins with the right to move through the world without suspicion, without fear, without having to prove your innocence before you've even been accused of a crime. He could feel the weight of the room, now every word settling like stone. Afterward, reporters swarmed him. Ross tried to shepherd him through, but Malcolm stopped when he saw a young black woman holding a microphone, her press badge reading Boston Student Times. "I'm a graduate student journalist," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "What would you say to young people of color who see what happened to you and think nothing's ever going to change?" Malcolm looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I'd tell them this. Change is slow, and it's painful, and it's fought for in moments just like this. You can't give up, because the second you do, the other side has already won." The student nodded, her eyes shining. That night, the clip of his lecture went viral. Hashtag sprang up Professor Hayes, airport profiling, one phone call. Some people were outraged. Others dismissed it, claiming protocol was followed. But buried among the noise were hundreds of personal stories from strangers, stories eerily similar to his own. And then, an unexpected twist. A whistleblower from TSA leaked an internal memo. The anonymous tip that led to Malcolm's detention? It hadn't been anonymous at all. It came from a retired police officer who had been removed from a university guest panel years earlier after Malcolm publicly criticized him for promoting racially biased policies. Suddenly, the incident wasn't just about profiling, it was about retaliation. Within 48 hours, Miller and the younger officer were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The retired cop who'd made the call found his name in headlines across the country. Malcolm's inbox flooded with interview requests. Civil rights organizations reached out, and amid it all, he received a single-line email from an address he didn't recognize. "You embarrassed the wrong people. Watch your back." He stared at it for a long time before forwarding it to Ross and deleting it. He refused to be intimidated. The following week, Malcolm returned to Atlanta. At the airport, he walked through security without incident. But as he stepped into the terminal, he caught the eye of a TSA officer, young, black, with a badge that read J. Carter. Dr. Hayes? Carter asked softly. Yes. Just wanted to say thank you. What you did speaking out, it means more than you know. Malcolm smiled faintly. We all have a role to play, Officer Carter. Yours might just change the system from the inside. He walked away, the wheels of his briefcase rolling steadily behind him. The morning sun streamed through the glass walls, casting long shadows on the floor. For the first time in days, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. The ride from the Atlanta airport to his home in Decatur felt different this time. Malcolm stared out the window as the city blurred by murals on brick walls, corner barbershops, clusters of school children with backpacks too big for their frames. All of it felt more vivid now, as if the confrontation in Boston had sharpened his vision. But the email still echoed in the back of his mind. Watch your back. He hadn't told his mother about it. At 74, she was sharp as a tack, but carried a worry that could turn to panic if she sensed danger to her only son. He'd already put her through enough stress when he was younger, wrongful stops by police, the night she had to bail him out after a protest arrest. He'd promised her that the academic path was safer. He was starting to wonder if he'd lied. That evening, Malcolm poured himself a glass of water and sat at his kitchen table with his laptop. Emails piled up, requests from civil rights groups, offers to speak at universities, invitations to appear on morning shows. He deleted the fluff, replied to a few genuine ones, and left the rest for Ross to manage. Then his phone rang. It was Claire Donovan. Malcolm, she said without preamble. I just got off the phone with a contact at DHS. The investigation into your case is escalating. That tip, it didn't just come from that retired cop. Someone inside TSA approved acting on it without standard verification. That's a breach of protocol. Which means there's going to be political fallout. And they're going to try to manage it quietly unless someone keeps the pressure on. He sighed. I'm tired, Claire. I know. But you're also the only person who can tell this story with the credibility it needs. If you back off now, they'll bury it. And this will keep happening to people without your connections, without your platform. Malcolm closed his eyes. She was right, of course. But being right didn't make the weight on his shoulders any lighter. The next day, Ross called with news that made his stomach knot. You're being subpoenaed to testify before a congressional oversight committee. They want to hear directly about the incident. Let me guess, they're going to frame it as a one-off mistake, Malcolm said bitterly. Maybe, but it's also a chance to put this on record. You'll be under oath. That matters. Washington, D.C. was cold the morning Malcolm walked into the Rayburn House office building. TV cameras lined the hallways, their lights glaring. He wore a navy suit, and the same tie he'd worn to his first job interview out of grad school. Lucky once, maybe lucky again. Inside the committee room, a long mahogany table stretched under fluorescent lights. Members of Congress shuffled papers, whispered to aides, adjusted microphones. When it was his turn, Malcolm leaned toward the mic and began without notes. I am not here because I am special. I am here because I was lucky. Lucky to have a friend with power. Lucky to have a platform that made people listen. The majority of people who experience what I did at Logan Airport do not get that luck. They get silence, humiliation, and in some cases violence. He told them about the morning in the terminal, the tip, the detention, the phone call. He didn't raise his voice, but he didn't soften it either. When a congressman from Texas asked whether he believed race had been a factor, Malcolm met his gaze and said simply, "It was the factor." A murmur went through the room. Cameras clicked. Somewhere behind him, Ross exhaled quietly. The hearing made national headlines. But it also drew out the trolls. His social media filled with threats, slurs, accusations that he'd played the race card. One particularly venomous post included his home address. Ross urged him to go to the police. Claire offered to arrange a temporary security detail. Malcolm refused both. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his life. But he did start locking his doors earlier. One night, about a week later, he was grading papers in his study when he heard the crunch of tires on his gravel driveway. No one had texted ahead. He peered out the window. A black SUV idled at the curb, its headlights cutting across his yard. For a moment, he considered calling Claire. Instead, he stepped onto the porch, phone in hand. The SUV pulled away slowly, disappearing into the dark. The next morning, a small white envelope lay on his doormat. No address, no stamp, just his name in block letters. Inside was a single photograph. Him, at the Boston airport, surrounded by the two TSA officers, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been standing in line behind him. On the back, scrawled in pen, "We're not done." Ross's reaction was immediate. "We need to take this to the FBI." Malcolm hesitated. What if that's exactly what they want? To make me feel hunted, paranoid. To make me look over my shoulder until I stop speaking out. But if this escalates? Ross, it's already escalated. The question is whether I retreat or keep going. Malcolm chose the latter. He gave interviews to The Atlantic, PBS, and a major podcast on systemic bias in law enforcement. His voice was calm, his arguments precise, but beneath it all was steel. In one interview, the host asked what he hoped would come of all this. "I hope," Malcolm said, "that no one else ever has to rely on a miracle phone call to prove they belong in an airport, a classroom, a neighborhood, or this country." Weeks passed. The congressional hearing prompted a DHS review of TSA protocols. The retired cop who'd made the call faced a civil lawsuit. Miller resigned quietly, while the younger officer whose name Malcolm learned was David Kindle reached out to him privately. The message was short. "I froze that day. I knew it didn't feel right, but I didn't stop it. I'm sorry. I'm leaving TSA. I want to help if I can." Malcolm didn't reply immediately, but days later, he invited Kindle to speak to his students via Zoom. The former officer told them what it felt like to stand in a room, know something was wrong, and do nothing. He called it the worst mistake of his life. Afterward, one student told Malcolm it was the first time she'd heard a white law enforcement officer admit that kind of failure so openly. The threats never fully stopped, but neither did the messages of support. Letters arrived from strangers, some thanking him, others sharing their own stories. One, from a retired black flight attendant, stayed with him. "I've seen this happen to passengers for 40 years. I used to praise someone with your voice and Reach would live through it and tell the world. Thank you for surviving and for speaking." Late one evening, Malcolm found himself sitting on his porch, the cicadas humming in the Georgia heat. His mother's voice drifted from the living room, where she was on the phone with a friend. He caught pieces of it, proud of him, scary, but necessary, just like his father. The gravel driveway was empty. No SUVs. No envelopes. Just the quiet comfort of a summer night. He thought about the road ahead, the policies that still needed changing, the hearts and minds that still needed shifting. He knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something like peace. 3 months after the incident at Logan Airport, the world felt different yet the same. The media frenzy had calmed, replaced by the slow grind of legal processes and bureaucratic hearings. But Malcolm's life had not gone back to what it was before. He had become, unwillingly, a symbol. Invitations kept coming to conferences, panels, TV shows, but he chose carefully, speaking only when he felt his words could cut through the noise instead of adding to it. The investigation into TSA's handling of the tip was nearing its end. The DHS report was rumored to be damning, citing procedural failures, racial bias, and deliberate negligence in verifying the source. That meant someone, somewhere, would have to take responsibility. Still, the anonymous threats hadn't completely stopped. One chilly October morning, Malcolm was walking across Emory University's campus when his phone rang. Ross's voice came through, tight with urgency. "You need to see this," Ross said. "Check your email. Now." In his inbox was a PDF leaked before it was meant to be public. It was the DHS report, stamped confidential. He skimmed through page after page until one paragraph made him stop cold. The tip leading to Dr. Malcolm Hayes' detention originated from former Officer Robert K. Langley. Internal records show Langley maintained contact with multiple current TSA employees, including Senior Officer Gregory Miller. Evidence suggests personal animus against Dr. Hayes stemming from a 2018 academic panel where Drive Hayes challenged Langley's policies on racial profiling. The report didn't stop there. It named Miller directly, noting that he had bypassed standard verification because the subject matched the tip's description, which in the recorded call Langley had described as a tall black man with a briefcase. Reading it felt like déjà vu. Malcolm had spent his career proving the existence of patterns and data inequities in education, discrimination in hiring, but seeing it spelled out in black and white about his own life hit harder than any lecture hall statistic. Ross's voice cut through his thoughts. "It's going public tomorrow. Once it does, the narrative changes completely. They won't be able to call it a misunderstanding anymore. It's documented retaliation and bias. Malcolm stared out the window at the quad, where students bustled between classes, unaware of the storm about to break. What happens to Langley? He'll probably face civil action. Criminal charges are less likely statutes, jurisdiction issues. But his career? Over. And Miller? Termination. Possibly barred from working in security again. Malcolm let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He didn't feel joy, just a kind of solemn finality. Justice wasn't a celebration. It was a weight being set down, piece by piece. That evening, Claire called. "You know this is going to get messy," she warned. "When people lose power, they lash out. Are you ready for more of that?" "I've been living in messy since that morning at Logan," Malcolm said. "But I'm also ready for it to mean something." The next day, the DHS report went public. News alerts lit up phones across the country. Cable anchors spoke his name alongside words like retaliation, racial profiling, and systemic failure. And then, unexpectedly, the apology came. It wasn't from Miller or even from TSA headquarters. It was from David Kindle, a younger officer from that day who went on live television and said, "I failed to act. I failed to speak. And I will carry that failure with me. Dr. Hayes deserved better. Every passenger deserves better." It wasn't enough to undo the harm, but it was a rare and public acknowledgement of guilt. Social media lit up with both praise and cynicism. Malcolm read it all, quietly absorbing the weight of being at the center of a conversation that was bigger than him. 2 weeks later, Harvard invited him back, not to give a lecture, but to moderate a panel titled Airports, Authority, and Accountability. Among the panelists was a young law student who had been in the terminal that day and had captured the first photo of him being detained. She'd since written her thesis on airport policing and civil rights. During the Q&A, a student asked Malcolm if he believed anything had truly changed since the incident. He thought for a long moment before answering. Change isn't always visible right away. It's not a light switch, it's erosion. It's slow, relentless pressure on a system until the cracks turn into breaks. That day at Logan Airport didn't change the system, but it made another crack. And one day, maybe not in my lifetime, those cracks will give way. The student nodded, and the room was quiet in the way a room gets when people are thinking more than they're breathing. The real closure came unexpectedly, months later, in an airport far from Boston. Malcolm was on his way to Johannesburg for a conference when a TSA officer, Latina, mid-30s, waved him forward at security. She scanned his ID, then looked up with a small smile. "Safe travels, Dr. Hayes," she said, as if she'd been waiting to say it. There was no drama, no suspicion, just a simple acknowledgement that he was seen. He walked toward his gate, the hum of the terminal in his ears. For the first time in a long time, the airport felt like just another place in the world, neither battleground nor trap. On the flight, Malcolm opened his laptop to work on a book he'd been writing in fragments for years. The working title was The Space Between Gates. It wasn't just about airports, it was about all the thresholds where dignity and suspicion collide, and what it takes to step through them intact. In the introduction, he wrote, "They called it a misunderstanding. I call it a mirror, one that shows us who we are and who we pretend not to be." He paused, staring out the window at the curve of the earth below. Somewhere down there, someone else was being stopped, questioned, doubted for no reason beyond how they looked. But somewhere else, another officer was letting a passenger pass through without trouble, without bias, without fear. The fight wasn't over, but neither was hope. Malcolm smiled faintly, closed his laptop, and let the steady hum of the engines carry him forward. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.